Hey everyone, and welcome back to Danis Podcast. If you're new here, a warm welcome to you. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our deep dives into the events that have shaped our world. Today, we're journeying back to the 1950s to explore a conflict that's often overshadowed by World War II and the Vietnam War but is no less impactful, the Korean War. So grab a seat, and let's dive in. Alright, so let's set the scene. It's post-World War II, and the world is still recovering from one of the most devastating conflicts in history. But even as the dust is settling, new tensions are brewing. The United States and the Soviet Union, former allies, are now locked in a struggle of ideologies. This is the start of the Cold War, a time when the world was split between communism and capitalism, and the stakes were global. After World War II, the Korean Peninsula, which had been under Japanese rule, was divided at the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union took control of the North, while the United States took responsibility for the South. This division wasn't meant to be permanent, but as both superpowers tried to establish their influence, it quickly became clear that reunification would be challenging. So, North Korea developed as a communist state under Kim Il-sung, with the backing of the Soviet Union, and South Korea took a different path under Syngman Rhee, with support from the US. Now, imagine living in Korea at this time. You're waking up every day to hear stories of neighbors and families divided, communities split by an invisible line. It's not just a physical separation, it's ideological too, with each side convinced they're the true Korea. Tensions continued to escalate, and then, on June 25, 1950, everything changed. North Korea launched a surprise attack on South Korea, storming across the 38th parallel with tanks, artillery, and thousands of troops. They quickly pushed the South Korean army southward, capturing Seoul within days. It was a huge blow, and South Korea wasn't prepared for this level of aggression. The United States, fearing the spread of communism through Asia, decided to intervene. President Harry Truman viewed this as a test of the domino theory, the idea that if one country in a region fell to communism, others would soon follow. This wasn't just about Korea anymore, it was about stopping a potential wave of communism throughout Asia. And so, the US jumped in under the banner of the United Nations, with countries like the UK, Canada, Australia, and even smaller nations coming together to support South Korea. Now, let's talk tactics, because this is where things get interesting. The North Koreans initially had the upper hand. They had Soviet tanks and artillery, and they moved fast, pushing the South Korean forces all the way down to a small area around Busan, in the southeastern part of the country. This area became known as the Busan Perimeter. It was like the last line of defense. If they lost this, South Korea would be completely overrun. But then came a turning point, a bold, risky move led by General Douglas MacArthur. In September 1950, MacArthur orchestrated the famous Incheon landing, a surprise amphibious attack far behind North Korean lines. Imagine someone sneaking up from behind when you're entirely focused on the front. MacArthur's forces landed at Incheon, recaptured Seoul, and forced the North Koreans to retreat. It was a huge morale booster for South Korea and the UN forces, and it allowed them to push the North Korean army back past the 38th parallel. But just when it seemed like South Korea might win, China entered the picture. Mao Zedong, the leader of China, wasn't about to let a pro-American government settle right on his border. So, he sent hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops across the Yalu River to support North Korea. These weren't just soldiers, they were well-trained, determined forces who knew the terrain and were willing to fight hard. The fighting grew intense, with both sides gaining and losing ground in what seemed like an endless back and forth. And it wasn't just ground troops. This war saw the first ever jet versus jet combat, as U.S. F-86 Sabres went up against Soviet-made MiG-15s flown by North Korean and Chinese pilots. Helicopters were also used extensively for the first time to transport troops and evacuate the wounded, changing the dynamics of battlefield logistics. It was a modern war, but fought in rugged, mountainous terrain and brutal winter conditions that added another layer of hardship for soldiers on both sides. The Korean War also saw some of the most brutal battles of the Cold War. Places like Pork Chop Hill and Heartbreak Ridge became symbols of the tough, relentless fighting that defined this conflict. Soldiers dug into the hillsides, facing artillery bombardments, freezing temperatures, and constant attacks. The war was grinding, with each side suffering massive casualties, but neither side gaining a decisive edge. And then there were the psychological tactics. The US used loudspeakers to broadcast messages to the North Korean troops, trying to undermine their morale. On the other side, North Korea and China used propaganda against the UN forces, attempting to paint the Americans and their allies as imperialists trying to control Asia. By 1953, after 3 years of brutal fighting, it became clear that neither side could achieve total victory. The war had reached a stalemate. Peace talks had been ongoing for 2 years, but both sides were stubborn, refusing to compromise. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed. This was not a peace treaty, it was simply an agreement to stop the fighting. The Korean Peninsula remained divided along the 38th parallel, with a DMZ demilitarized zone marking one of the most fortified borders in the world. The Korean War might not have changed the map, but it had a massive impact on the people and politics of the region. Families were separated, unable to cross the border. And today, more than 70 years later, that armistice line still stands, with North and South Korea technically still at war. For the United States, the Korean War was a stark reminder of the challenges of foreign intervention. It set a precedent for the U.S. approach to the Cold War, shaping strategies in conflicts like the Vietnam War. And for Korea itself, the war laid the foundation for two very different paths. South Korea emerged as a democratic powerhouse, with a strong economy and global influence, while North Korea remained isolated, developing nuclear weapons and maintaining a government known for its strict control. In the end, the Korean War teaches us about the complexities of global conflicts. It wasn't just a battle between North and South, it was a clash of ideologies, a struggle between superpowers, and a tragedy that left a lasting mark on millions of lives. The legacies of this war are still visible today, from the highly fortified DMZ to the ongoing tensions that occasionally flare up between North and South Korea. Alright, folks, that wraps up today's episode of Danis Podcast. If you found this episode enlightening, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let us know what topics you'd like us to explore next. History has so many lessons to offer, and I can't wait to bring you more stories that shape our understanding of the world. Thanks for tuning in, stay curious, and I'll catch you in the next episode.